Hi, everybody. Thanks a lot for joining our slightly complex named webinar about uncomplicating product strategy. Let me just share my screen and we can get started. There we go. I think everybody can see my screen now. As I said, we're talking today about uncomplicating product strategy, practical approach. My name is Elad Simon. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Craft.io, and I'm delighted to host today Nacho Bassino, a good friend. And Nacho, I'll let you introduce yourself before we kind of dive into everything.
Absolutely. Yeah, so these days I mostly coaching and consulting with companies, also training product managers, but I have been leading product teams for many years now, different companies, industries, countries. And yeah, based on that, I started working heavily in strategy as part of my product leadership roles. And I found at some point in time that I couldn't explain how to do product strategy, and that got me a bit nervous. So I dived deep into the problem, and eventually I wrote a book 2 years ago called Product Direction that tackles a bit this problem and probably related to the things we will discuss today. Perfect.
Well, thanks for the introduction. And as I suspect many of you on today, product strategy is indeed one of those big topics that I think a lot of people believe the necessity of and understand that it's critical for the success of their product work and product organization to a degree, but a lot of people struggle with. You know, I used to be a consultant in my distant past, a management consultant in my very distant past, and I always said that strategy is one of those abused words, right? So it's used many different ways in many different variations, and it's not always obvious how to do that. So I love having this conversation today. I'm going to kick it off just to get everybody more engaged and excited about things, right? So I'm going to kick it off with a couple of polls, and so that you guys can participate and share your perspective about this before we dive into the actual core of today's conversation. So I'm going to start with a poll that talks a little bit about your struggle with product strategy. So I'm going to share it now. And so you guys can have an opportunity to share with us what is your biggest challenge, and you have only one choice. So please pick the biggest challenge when it comes to developing a product strategy. So you should be seeing the poll now. And so please read through it and choose, and we'll give it a minute or so so people can have time. I always love watching these numbers kind of run around. We'll see in a bit, in a minute. The outcomes. All right, we're reaching a good capacity, a good percentage of participants. So we're getting there. Yeah, and I give it 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and there you go. I hope you can now see the results. Yes. Can everybody see the results? So the winner is definitely defining clear objectives, but it's not a winner. It's not a 70% winner, right? So it's 31%, and then you have prioritizing what to build, aligning with the company goals, and then communication of the strategy. So it's an interesting picture, right? So at least from my perspective, I don't know what you think about it, Nacho. I would love to hear your experience from this as well. For me, it means that people struggle with a lot of things more than anything else, because it's kind of a balanced picture. What do you think?
Absolutely. I think that the kind of strategy is one of these topics that changes a lot from company to company, even, for example, company size or product maturity. So it's normal to see different problems for different people. And luckily, what I was thinking about is that we will see some of these problems reflected on the things we will talk about later on. So hopefully we'll have some tips.
Perfect. So that's our first poll, and thanks a lot for answering so eloquently about that. And then the second one, which I'm going to launch now, and then we'll get started, is about time allocation, as in how much time do you actually invest to product strategy. And so I'm gonna open that poll as well, and hopefully you'll be able to see it now. So how much time do you invest to product strategy in your typical work week, or an average? Or so let's see where this takes us.
Now I'm expecting a clear winner. Let's see if my hypothesis is correct.
Let's see. Well, we gave a cop-out answer with it varies greatly, right? So that's like the yeah. All right, I think we can close it in 3, 2, 1, and done. And let's share that as well. So yeah, it's not, I would say, for me, not a huge surprise. I would say the way I read the data is about 2/3 of people, the 35% and the 30%, say either it's very little, like, not a lot, or it depends, kind of thing, right? So it's not like for me, the it varies greatly means it's like more of a ad hoc-y kind of thingy, rather than an ongoing effort. And then you see here teams that invest 2 to 5 hours, but that's not the majority. The majority would be definitely in the either what we define as a little time, and then the other one is like very good. Any thoughts about that, Nacho, from your perspective and from your experience as well?
Yeah, it's interesting because I have 2 thoughts. The first one is that I will usually go for it varies greatly, because there are these periods of time, for example, the quarterly check-ins or the yearly budget planning, in which you go kind of full mode into strategy and you spend a lot of time working on that. And the other thought I had is that that makes it kind of vary from period of time.
Yeah.
The other thought I had that depending on who is on joining us today, maybe depending on your role, you spend more time or less time. So this is also another interesting lens to cut this information with. Say, for example, product leaders maybe spend more time that product managers in strategy, and that's a natural problem with the scope of the role.
Understand. All right. Thanks for that, for those insights, and thanks everybody, of course, for sharing your thoughts about that. And we're done with our polls for now. We have one more poll, which I'll try to remember to launch if I'm good about that. And let's get started. So before, just one housekeeping rule before we get started. Feel free to ask questions. We do have a Q&A, or you can also ask via the chat. It's probably easier for a lot of people to ask via the chat as well. So feel free to ask on the fly. We'll try to find good points to stop, and get some questions in as part of the conversation, rather than wait until the end. So feel free to engage on an ongoing basis. And with that in mind, let's get started. So Nacho, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, so as I said, we will try to make it a bit more interactive, so feel free to interrupt. But what I want to start with is that we made this question of what are your challenges to the strategy, which was to be a bit tricky, because the big problem is that most companies don't even have a product strategy. And don't take my word for it. Marty Kagan said this a couple of years ago before he launched Empowered, his latest book. And he shared that many of the companies he worked with, and he works with very good companies, don't even have a product strategy. It's not that product strategy is bad or not communicated or any of the problems we said before, is that it's simply inexistent. So we're saying part of the work I did, I tried to kind of research into this problem, why this was happening. And I tried to represent it here with what is called the jobs to be done forces diagram, which says in a nutshell that for users to go from an existing way of solving a problem or a certain product they have to adopt a new behavior or a new product, they have some forces that will push them to make the change, but some forces that will prevent from doing it. And in the pushing forces side, the interesting part is that we all want to be more strategic. There is no product leader out there that you will face and he will say, or she will say, no, I don't need a strategy. We don't need to be more strategic. So we are all eager to be more strategic. The problem is that the blocking forces are stronger than these pushing forces, and there are many things out there that are kind of very easy to grasp. Like, for example, all-day firefighting, so we cannot focus time. And this goes back to the little time we dedicated in the question we asked there as well. But one of the problems I see over and over is that we don't even know how to do it. We don't even know what product strategy is or how we will look when we do it. So that lack of method that is signaled there is the topic I focused on. And that's why I try to make this more practical approach, so you can have some building blocks that you can work with. So if we go to the next one, I will again try and keep it short. I will try to give you a nutshell what a strategy process can look like in practice. And I will start with some preventing words, which is as I was saying before, strategy changes a lot from company to company, company size, industry, the stability or maturity of the product. So there are many changes, but usually most companies or most people going through the product strategy process will go through these blocks. And the blocks I will try to signal are the fourth ones in the middle. So insights usually is the first one. Then you do select, you create some goals, and you synthesize it. And there are two blocks at the beginning and the end, which are not necessarily phases because they are more ongoing. So, for example, when you are starting the strategy process, it's not that you will go and gather information. Gathering information is something that hopefully most product teams are doing continuously. So you will be doing research, discovery, reading marketing reports, benchmarking, and whatnot. And when you sit down to do the strategy, you already have all this information at your fingertips. And
so no, go ahead. Sorry, I cut you.
I was going to say that at the other extreme, we have the communication, which is essentially the same. You need to become this evangelist of your strategy. So when you complete this presentation for the strategy, you will need to go through it over and over and find places to make this connection from what you are executing all the way up to your strategy to keep it fresh in people's minds and make it actually usable.
I see. So basically what you're saying is that like those 4 steps in the middle here, like insight, select, goals, and synthesis, that's the part of the process from a strategy perspective. And the 2 on the sides basically are like not periphery, but like an ongoing effort rather than like if I condense my time to do this. By the way, from a frequency perspective, we've asked this. I mean, from a frequency perspective, ignoring the 2 on the side, that like the thing in the middle, like what do you see? And I can share also my perspective. What do you see when company, like in terms of like how often do companies actually sit down and do, quote unquote, do product strategy, if that's a thing?
It's a good way to frame it, because I will answer concretely first, saying that usually it's around 12 months. So maybe tied to a budget process or an annual forecasting process. So you will have some more, say, deeper or more thoughtful exercise trying to come up, okay, this is what we are planning to do next year or something like that. But on the other hand, as you were saying, this quote unquote is because strategy more and more is becoming something that is continually progressing and continually refined. So you will have a strategy, and we will talk later about goals and assumptions, but you will have some strategic assumptions and you will try to do some discovery. And when you identify more information, you will either refine the strategy or change it and pivot. So it's something that you will want to monitor continually.
Yeah, so I by the way, just to share my own perspective on this, and we meet with a lot of product organizations on an ongoing basis, and indeed, I think the annual cadence is probably the most common one that we see. Some companies, like especially in like industries, are a little bit more rigid. Will have maybe even a 3-year product like a strategy kind of a cycle, but I think most companies indeed would have an annual cycle with quarterly or half yearly kind of like iteration, like smaller iterations of the strategy, like revisit and check, and that so that's what I was seeing as well. So that thanks for that. All right, so let's dive in, shall we?
Yeah, actually now the goal is to explain these 4 steps, because these words may be a bit confusing.
Of course.
So let's try to start with insights. So insights, again, may sound like this kind of word that is reserved for the enlightened ones, but actually it's nothing further from the truth. It's something that product teams usually do day in, day out, trying to identify insights. It's probably what you are doing when you are doing discovery. When we are framing it from a strategy perspective, what we are trying to do is to map all the opportunities that we may have that come from problems that we can solve or tendencies in the market or opportunities to improve how we serve the customers, that we identify that if we act on it, we can have an interesting impact or radically change the game, as said there. And why they are so important is because we are trying to make a strategy that is based on facts and on real opportunities we can address, rather than doing some kind of following hunches or doing these big inspirations that doesn't really mean anything or doesn't really tell the teams how we are planning to deliver on those big ambitions. So that's why insights is kind of this first step in which you are trying to map the opportunity space and you are trying to really understand where are the places that you can put your bets on.
And you separated, like in your previous slide, you separated from gathering information. So this is not the fact-finding exercise of like, I look at my analytics or I talk to customers, or you're separating that from like the actual insights part, right?
Yeah, that's a good point actually, because that depends more on the process that teams are having. So for example, there are teams that when they're, for example, the advanced teams doing some continuous discovery in those fancy terms, and they will be kind of updating this opportunity solution tree constantly. And this is part of what I will definitely call insights. So you can do some more insights continually as well. But for some teams, as you were saying, maybe they are, for example, they are probably checking their analytics constantly, but they don't really capture the insights at that moment. But when they start doing strategy, they need to say, okay, what are our biggest opportunities? And this will rely on the information they have to synthesize some insights and define where they can act.
Got it. All right. There was a question, by the way, coming about like, can we share the presentation? So I hope, Nacho, with your permission, we can share some of the slides. Perfect. So yeah, we definitely share it afterwards as part of the follow-up email. So go ahead.
All right. Then moving to the next one, I want to try to make this a bit more actionable, and I already hinted that one of the tools I use. So for each of the steps I have for strategy, I try to put concrete tools. So it's not just the concept, but something that you can do actionable. But on the other hand, as I was saying, there are so many different tools and so many different strategies out there that it's not prescriptive by any means. So you may be doing differently. What's important to me is that you are, as I was saying, capturing all your opportunity space. And one of the most famous tools to do so is the Opportunity Solution Tree by Teresa Torres. That's a great tool. Why? For many different reasons. First one is that it helps you organize things from bigger opportunity to kind of more focused and lower level opportunities. So you usually have, for companies doing strategy, especially bigger companies or complex products, you will have multiple levels of opportunities. You will start with something kind of higher level, like for example, going to my example that I will describe maybe before jumping to bring the boxes. This example is coming from a company that was on the groceries delivery space a few years ago, so it's not kind of super recent. And they were already with good product market fit in some cities, and they are trying to increase their revenues. And they started with one very particular insight, which is they needed to put more stores in their app in order to be able to grow these revenues and deliver more. So this was kind of their biggest topic. And they started trying to understand what they could do to come up with these ideas to bring more stores. And the biggest for them was to improve the onboarding process that they had was very cumbersome. The problem with that is that as they had this big insight already numbering there, they were super focused on that one. And what the Opportunity Solution Tree helped them do is to see what else they could do to increase grocery sales. So they identified that they had opportunities around increasing the frequency and conversion rate. They have opportunities around increasing the average order value for a particular customer. And they started listing all the opportunities they can cover for this particular goal they were trying to achieve as part of their strategic ambition. So again, what they are trying to do here, or what the Opportunity Tree helps you do, is to map this in a very nice ways because it has some shape and structure. Again, you can use whatever you want as long as you are giving some shape and structure. And it allows you to think more broadly and not focus on the first idea or the first insight you come across, because you can keep asking this question, okay, what other things I can do to get to this outcome of this opportunity.
Yeah, and I think, by the way, one of the things that, again, as an ex-consultant in my past, one of the things that people tend to underestimate is the power of templates and frameworks, right? So I know it's by the way, I love those opportunity tree and obviously read a lot about it from a friend Teresa Torres around this topic. It's eventually strategic frameworks, and there are many, right? So this is not the only one, I think, for identifying insights, right? So they help like sharpen the thinking and like have a process of thinking, right? So just like for me, that for me is the key benefit of having a framework in mind. We almost regardless of the type of framework. Would you agree with that statement?
Sorry, yeah. For example, one easy counter example I use is impact mapping. Impact mapping can also be something very similar to this, study what you are trying to achieve and what are the opportunities. So it's very similar structure, and again, something that is very popular because it's a kind of visual tool. And you can even, for example, if you are showing meeting stakeholders, it's something that's very easy to grasp and to put them in your same kind of thinking status or mindset to kind of contribute to this opportunity finding.
Yeah, the other thing I really like about this specific methodology, I would say, is the drill down concept, right? So the actual like drilling down into so that it's almost leaning towards like saying, hey, okay, yes, you have some thoughts here, but let's take the next step of drilling down, which I think I find that very strong as a method, again, as a methodology, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Okay, I guess we can move to the next
yes.
page. And this is probably what I usually call the heart of the strategy, because as we all know, strategy is about, when we say focus, it's about kind of seeing all these opportunities we identify in the previous step and saying no to most of them, which is sounds very tragic, but at the end of the day, what we are trying to do is to understand what are the trade-offs of saying yes or no to one or the other. And also, and most importantly, it's about the positioning and the differentiation we want to achieve in the market, which should be tied to an advantage that we want to create and defend over time. That may sound like a mouthful, but what I'm trying to say is that this is different from selective based on ROI. So we are not trying to do a business case sort of for each opportunity and to say this is the biggest business case. We are trying to really say, okay, this is the way we want our customers to select us in the future, and this is what we need to build in order to get to that positioning. And one story I really like about that is the story of a very, very early Netflix. And this story is told in the book That Will Never Work by Mark Randolph, one of the early founders of Netflix. And basically what he said is this very early Netflix was selling and renting DVDs by email, so very early days. And was approached, but also a very early Amazon, which was already big and already consolidated as a very big bookstore. It was starting to grow into new verticals. And of course, they approached because they were considering buying Netflix to jumpstart their DVD part of the business, of vertical. Of course, as we all know, the deal never happened. By the time the founders of Netflix walked out of that room, they knew that they would never be able to compete with Amazon, that Amazon was going to enter the DVD markets. And when they do that, they will never be able to compete on the sell DVDs value proposition. So they decided after that bidding to ditch the sell DVDs side of the business and really focus on the rent DVD by email, in which they can create a good positioning and a differentiation for their markets, and a kind of the reason for the user to choose them. And the interesting side of the story is that at the moment they made a decision, selling DVDs was more than 90% of the revenues. So hopefully the trade-offs you need to make in your day-to-day are not as dramatic as that one. But what's interesting about the story is that this selection that we are trying to do is really focused on this differentiation and advantage that we can build and defend over time.
Yeah, and I think, by the way, that's a really important point to touch upon, because I think in many cases people think of, I'm going to put a list, I'm going to open an Excel spreadsheet, I'm going to put my ROI drivers, effort versus impact, value versus effort of shape, it doesn't matter which poison you choose in terms of that. But what you're saying, actually, it's not that. It's actually, you're saying basically, there needs to be something more strategic at the company level, almost pulling you up to say, hey, this is the stuff we need to focus on, rather than this because of reasons A, B, C, which are strategic to the company itself. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, absolutely. And then you said something very interesting, because I always say that, I mean, there is a difference between product strategy and company strategy. The difference is less obvious when there is a kind of mono-product software as a service company, than when you have a kind of company and it's more like, I don't know, e-commerce. I work in travel, for example, for a long time. There is a company strategy that drives the strategy of all the departments, and then the product strategy should be trying to kind of fit to that company strategy. And exactly as you said, the positioning that they're trying to build is not a positioning that the product team is trying to do. It's kind of the company is trying to do this, and hopefully, the marketing team or the sales team is trying to build towards that same positioning, and you are helping them from the product perspective. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things I think people like need to remember, that eventually a product strategy lives within the context of a company rather than as a standalone artifact, right? I think in a lot of cases people tend to forget that eventually, but I do think that even if you have your OKRs or your like strategy as a product team, one of the key things to do is to make sure. I mean, you're saying something more dramatic than making sure. You're saying that should be your driver of selection, right? So that's a very strong statement. But at the very least, make sure that you're aligned with that, and that you're able to justify your product strategy in the context of the larger company, or like like what the company is trying to achieve. Your business, depending on the size, could be like your business unit or your company as a whole, kind of thing.
Yes, and to be honest, I mean, I think is as dramatic as kind of have this very strong bonding, because at the end of the day, if you are doing something that is kind of, let's say, more or less aligned, or we can, we can justify anything, so we can always say that, yeah, it's aligned in this very random way. But if it's not really tied to it, what will happen is that you will have your strategy, and then you will start receiving requests from all over the place with different things that are related to the company strategy. So the more tight you make that bond to the company strategy, the easier it is for you to say, okay, I will really focus on this one, and will say no to everything else, and I'm building towards what all other departments should be building. So it's, I would say, helping empowerment and helping drive more success.
No, absolutely. And I think, we'll talk about it later, but I'm sure it also connects with the stakeholder management around strategy, because I think one of the key things eventually as a product organization, you want to achieve with your selection, something that people say that, oh, this makes sense. And then they can support you on funding and, getting the resources that you need to actually deliver on it. And if you don't have I would say even the visual connection to the company and where it's going, specifically senior stakeholders, like C-level, will struggle, like really struggle to understand, why is this happening? Like, yes, you've done a beautiful solution, like like opportunity tree, and that's great. But if you can't connect it to what I am thinking, like what's my priorities as a C-level in a company, how does that work?
Basically, I mean, it's and yeah, maybe we are going too deep into this conversation, but another way to frame it is the way you create your product strategy is not like you kind of close the door of a little room and you write the strategy and say, hey, this is my corporate strategy. You will do it in combined with many of the stakeholders that you will have conversations with. So that's where this alignment will naturally tend to flow or come from, because you will need to justify the things that you're selecting based on those needs from the ecosystem.
No, absolutely. We get a lot of questions about whether we're going to share this, the recording, the deck. So yes, the answer is absolutely yes. We're going to share both the recording, and post this conversation, we're going to share the recording and the presentation as well. So you guys, obviously it means that people like it. Otherwise, if they don't nobody wants a presentation they're not going to use. So absolutely. Let's move on.
Let's move on. Objectives. And actually, this is probably also related to what we were just discussing, because when we have these very strong drivers that we selected, these kind of cool opportunities or problems that we need to solve, we need to make sure we have a way to measure success. So if we are successful in doing this, how this will look like, and hopefully this is something that is very kind of usually done by product teams, so I will not need to explain too much. One thing I want to add is that when we say in the strategy in the context of a strategy in which we are aiming for longer term analysis, we are always basing these goals on assumptions. Some assumptions are kind of higher risk and or lower risk, but we have statistical assumptions underlying these goals. And many teams are not making this visible. And the problem with that is that it reduces the empowerment of the teams or the input the teams can have for discovery, because if you give them these statistical assumptions, what teams can do afterwards is validate them. And this goes back to the kind of the situation with the stakeholders we're measuring, because many times we'll need to make decisions without having all the answers. And what we need to communicate and be transparent with stakeholders is we are taking this path, but these are the risks or the assumptions we are making. And we will start by validating those to make it to make sure that we are on the right path, or decide what to do if we are wrong.
So can you give an example of assumptions that you're using for that, or?
That's the next slide. So that's a great question.
Great questions have slides, right? So clearly.
Yeah, so to make it very concrete, for going back to our previous example, the one that I was showing the opportunity tree, these companies I was saying they were groceries delivery. So for example, one thing that they were considering doing is adding a new sub-vertical within groceries, which is the fresh produce, so fruits and vegetables. They didn't have at the moment in their app. And they were having a very clear goal. They were aiming to increase the average order value because people will buy more products with them that they will purchasing elsewhere. But the assumption was that the users will be willing to purchase these fresh products through the app because, for example, selecting how mature the tomatoes are or bananas are is not something that you will normally do in an app, or it's harder to do in an app. So the risks were high, and this is kind of the last column, was high, medium, low. But anyways, you can do this again, not prescriptive, in any way that you want. The important thing is stating this assumption. And in this case, it's quite simple, because with this assumption, we can do a lot of research, a lot of discovery with the users to understand how they will do these selections, if they are willing to do it or not, and to kind of build a product that will really solve this assumption or this risk. So again, we can, I think it doesn't make sense to go to the other ones. The important thing is you will set a goal, and the goal will have some risks associated, some assumptions that we are making, and putting that on the table, or even in the form of hypothesis can also be another good option to make sure that you can jump into validation.
Yeah, if it's okay, let's touch a little bit about goal setting. So I mean, there's a lot of methodology about goal setting, specifically, SMART goals and all that, and all that. And I think it also touches a little bit like things like OKRs, etc. Do you have your own favorite methodology when it comes to goal setting? Or I have my own perspectives about it, but I'm happy to hear your thoughts first before I blabber on.
I use mostly OKRs. I have seen a lot of problems with OKRs, but I usually try to solve them rather than ditch them. And a few things that are important to say to me is that I usually, when talking about these strategic goals, I usually go for annual goals, or whatever time frame the strategy is trying to cover. So for example, and we'll see it now in the upcoming slides, you will have this increased average order value 10%. This is my annual goal. And I'm not expecting to see this completed in
tomorrow morning. Yeah, tomorrow morning.
So we will have, when we break down this problem into smaller problems and things that we want to continue doing, we will have more precise OKRs that are quarterly and can measure that we are making progress toward that goal.
Yeah. So go ahead.
No, the second framework I usually use is the time horizons for this McKinsey framework. And why I use them related to goals is because when you are setting a horizon 1 goal, which is basically increase your core business, that's when you can use a very concrete metric like increase average order value 10%. When you extend to further horizons, you need to be a bit more experimental. So for example, in horizon 2, which is expanding to adjacent markets, you will not necessarily measure an expansion to a new market as increase in a percentage increase in your core metric, because it will be just too low. And you are more focused on saying, hey, I'm getting engagement, I'm getting the growth rate I'm expecting, and those are the metrics that you will try to do. And for the third horizon, again, when you're doing strategy for kind of 3 years ahead and trying to be a bit more experimental, you will try to fit some sort of learning metric or something like that can give you a sense of we are making progress to these very unknown bets.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. About the point about horizons, and I think, my rule of thumb with goal setting is one, try to fit your company. So, for example, if your company uses a goal setting methodology of sort of, being OKRs or anything, it's almost like obvious that you're going to use something of that nature. And the second thing, of course, try to make it as measurable as possible, especially when it comes to the KRs or the goals in this case, so that you're able to then say, hey, yes, this worked or this didn't work, regardless of the time horizon, whether it's a quarterly one or an annual one. You want to be able to say, like, yeah, this is going in the right direction, especially, and of course, strategic goals or like strategy in general is designed for the bigger bets of the company is taking. It's not designed for your day-to-day, like the minor improvement in a specific feature, etc. It's really designed on, and so you're supposed to be able to see something meaningful, like a big needle moving in a certain direction.
One interesting problem, I mean, maybe to put out there, is that you have this challenge between the lagging indicators. Like, for example, if you put market share, for example, as one of your strategic goals, that's something that you will see after your strategy is executed. So I tend to say, okay, let's keep market share in sight, but let's put something more concrete that will tell us if right away if what we are doing is helping us get.
Absolutely. We're not gonna deep dive into goals at that, because there's like, you can talk about like goal setting in product like for forever, but yeah, I'm of course trying to avoid like lagging indicators that would, 3 years later you'll know if your strategy worked. That's not a very helpful indicator in that sense. One last question before we kind of move on. In terms of, I love this assumption like thing, because it puts it very like front and center in front of your stakeholders, like saying, hey, this is what we're doing, this is the assumption we're making. And you say, from what I heard from you, like saying, hey, that's actually very easy to validate. Like, actually, like you can, well, not necessarily easy, but you have a concrete way of validating that. What do you do in case of assumption that like you find and I've encountered in the past, like it's very difficult to validate the assumption before you actually do something. Sometimes, of course, you can. What are your maybe tips and tricks of like, how do you validate an assumption that is not obvious to do with like a small experiment or of that nature? Sorry.
But maybe one good example that we can mention is kind of hardware products. Hardware products, like, I don't know, let's say you're thinking about Google Glass, like, the Google Glass 10 years ago. And actually, there are very good talks about that, the experiments they did back then.
Yeah.
But again, I mean, even for that product, you have these, they release these cool videos, like kind of demo experience. They were totally fake, and they will actually create some very early prototypes, trying to see some of the actions, not the full range. So there are ways to start making progress. Of course, Google Glass is not a good example because it's a failure, but I mean, there are ways to experiment even in complex products. And the important thing is that you are making progress toward this validation. So I love the concept of the ladder of evidence, in which you can do very small things that will give you some level of kind of validation of these assumptions. And then you will start investing more over and over to do bigger experiments that will give you a bigger level of validation. So that's the way I usually see it. And there are more complex problems that have a very long ladder, and more smaller problems that are easier to validate.
Got it. Thanks for that. That's super helpful. All right, moving on.
Yeah, let's do the last one. So, and this is actually the easy one, and it's a kind of synthesizing your work. And if you go back one.
Oh, sorry.
Sean.
No. There you go.
So basically what we usually end up with when doing this strategy exercise is either a very long document or a very long slide deck. And what I usually try to say is that that's perfectly fine. And you need to do that because, I mean, strategy is hard, and you need to put all that information together and make sense of it. So you need that for sure. But at some point you need to synthesize it. Because why? Because you will need to evangelize with your thesis over and over and over again. So you will need some artifacts that people can easily grasp, that is not maybe self-sufficient, but will kind of trigger this, okay, yeah, this is what we discussed in that strategy meeting, and I remember what it is. So you can do it in any way that you like. I usually use this, what I call the drivers model, in which you have your strategic driver, very much what I would put in the table before, in the goals table. So you will have this, the name of strategic driver, you will have the key result you are trying to achieve, or the objective, the goal you're trying to achieve, and some brief explanation of why this is so important for your strategy. So trying to connect to the problem or the insight you had, that this makes this a very strong differentiation. So yeah, I usually tend to say that this is like the Picasso bull. I don't know if anyone knows the story, but basically Picasso have these pictograms of a bull that ends with a very few lines, and it's very famous and has been seen over and over again. But basically, if you look at the entire history of how he did, he actually draw like 12 bulls. And the first one, the one he started with, was a very, very detailed bull. And actually, for the first few pictograms, he adds more details to this bull. And this is the way you're doing with a strategy. You start with a very complete picture, try to gather information. And while you are building the strategy, you will add more details and add more information to the strategy to make sure you are kind of on the right spot. But then you need to simplify the communication. And then what Picasso starts doing is removing and removing complexity over and over in each pictogram until he ends with this kind of very few lines that you can totally recognize the bull, but it's very simple and a very simple drawing. So this is exactly the same exercise. You start with this very big document, but you will need to reduce to your very fundamentals.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, it touches very elegantly into the concept of communication eventually. And I think that's one of the things that people tend to like. I don't think it's neglecting. I think it's more to do with the fact that I think once you do so much strategy work with frameworks and discussions and prioritizations, you feel like you want to like almost bring the whole thing in front of people, and so that they experience. And by the way, to a degree, it's legitimate, because you can't just give the artifact and say like, hey, here's the outcome. This is what we're going to do. And this is the key results. And believe me, I've done a lot of work. So I think in many cases, people do tend to bring a lot into these presentations. But what I like about this is that eventually it synthesizes into something, that once the dust settles on the work of strategy, and as we mentioned at the beginning, this is like let's say it's an annual process, just for the simplicity. People need to still revisit this. And kind of like and know, and like, this is a guiding, eventually it's also a guiding light to say like, what are we trying to do and how are we measuring success for this? And so you don't want like a 60 slides deck just to understand what are we trying to do and how are we measuring it, right? So I like that synthesis into something that is very concrete. I mean, probably more than just one slide. It's probably like maybe a couple of slides, but at the end of the day, it's something that helps teams like focus, and like when you're talking about the strategy, then you can at least give people like something to look at. If that makes sense.
Actually, if you think about, for example, kind of telling the story of your strategy, so storytelling is also a big component of the communication part. But for example, one thing I tell to all product leaders is when you go in any strategy, any OKR meeting, so let's say you are kind of planning next quarter OKRs or reviewing the results or doing some mid-quarter checking, you want to start by kind of sharing these 1, 2, 3 slides in 5 minutes with a very short storytelling, so everyone can be reminded of what we're trying to achieve. And when you say something very important, is that you want everyone in the organization to be making decisions based on the strategy. And the only way to achieve that is that they kind of are constantly reminded of what the strategy is. So yeah, I think that's a very important piece of the puzzle.
Indeed. All right. Moving on.
Yeah, and we are almost there. So I had 2 more things to say. The first one is that this is kind of done with the strategy, but not done with execution. You will probably, so the way I usually do it is get these strategic drivers and try to put them in what I call strategic roadmap. That is kind of a challenging word because it may be different for different people. But basically, in a nutshell, is a set of coherent actions or a timeline that says, in order to achieve this, we need to solve these problems in this order. And then this will be a good way to jump into OKRs, because when you have this roadmap that is trying to put in order the problems you are trying to solve, then you will say, okay, next quarter, if we are solving this problem, this is the target we are trying to achieve. And that's why I usually, when you ask me about goal setting, I just say that if OKRs are very painful and you're changing OKRs drastically each quarter, is usually a symptom of lack of strategy, because if the strategy is kind of flowing logically, OKRs should be quote unquote very easy to do.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree. And by the way, this specific diagram is something taking the time to talk about ourselves a little bit in craft, we're very passionate about this stuff. And like, actually, like one of the things we try to do, and people would say successful, not successful, like within our solution is actually to bring all this together so that you're actually connecting, the execution work with the strategy work. And that's very, very important, I think, for a lot of product teams to be able to like put it all together and have a clear line of communication with everybody, and how does things cascade, from the strategy to the actual like delivery and the epics and the stories, the actual features that people are building, right? So, and I think that connectivity is something a lot of teams are lacking, and end up like it's interesting you put like a strategic roadmap, because I totally agree with you, because I think when you look at a lot of people's roadmaps, it's basically a list of features and when is it going to be delivered kind of thing, right? So in a way that misses out a lot of, like you do all this work of investing, thinking what is it that you're going to do, and then eventually and of course people care about the dates because they want to know, what's going on when, and that's like, I think everybody's excited about that, but you want to keep reminding people all the time about why are we doing this. And so like keeping that coherent picture, because some things you're going to build and they're not going to be great, and some things you're going to build and they're not going to work out as you plan. But at least having the whole picture gives you a sense of like, okay, we did this for a reason, even if it didn't work. At least we have a direction as a product organization, right? So I think that kind of makes sense.
That's why assumptions are important. I mean, if you are doing this work and you are proving or not proving, then you can okay, I was wrong, and then you can change. So this iteration of the strategy starts making sense when you have all the bits connected together.
No, absolutely. One other thing I would mention, and it's not on this diagram, but I think we spoke about it a little bit. Above all of this hovers the company strategy, right? So above all of this thing, there is like a hovering cloud of a company level strategy and direction or themes or whatever it is that your company is using. So that again, and that should be your guiding light, and you have to make sure that somehow all this connects in some very, very high level format to what the company is trying to achieve.
Absolutely.
All right.
We'll go to the final ones are basically related to one thing that we mentioned when we're discussing why this is so complicated. It's because we have so many terms for the same things that I just wanted to call out that we are using some terms, but you may be using different terms to probably speak about the same things. So for example, I mentioned insights, and then you can use maybe bets, maybe ideas, maybe opportunities, maybe problems. And insights is to the left because it's the one I use, but not because it's by any means right.
Because you're right. It's because you're right. That's it.
You can use it. You can use whatever terms work for you. I mean, I'm always saying that we have a taxonomy problem within product management. But other than that, I mean, use whatever makes more sense or brings more clarity in your own company. Same can be said for strategic selection. This is a very broad term, but you can be talking about the positioning or differentiation or advantages, and you probably are referring to the same thing. And we discuss a lot about goals. So for goals, you can use North Star, for example, or this big area versus goals, some other terminology that's used around strategy or goals for strategy, OKRs we already mentioned. So there are all these frameworks or things that to me are connected and are fine. What I want to probably, if I can leave something in people's mind, is that these steps are the important part. So the important part is that you are kind of mapping what are the opportunities that you can pursue, that you are selecting the most promising ones, that you are stating clearly the goals and assumptions, and then that you are bringing some artifact for communication. As long as we are doing that, whatever you use in the middle, totally fine. You can change it and use whatever terminology works for you.
Yeah, and I love the fact that you added this slide, because I think I can't overemphasize how I really believe that terminology and like is really the enemy in a lot of cases for a lot of people and for a lot of companies. And actually aligning on a terminology at the company level is so critical. I know it's, sometimes you think about this like, why is this important? I call it bets and you call it opportunities, and it's all great, it's all good. But it's unbelievable how people become passionate, over passionate about like, this is not this is that. and having actually like kind of like a dictionary, quote unquote dictionary for the company about how do we communicate this stuff, and is so important for companies. And the amount of time people spend on like this is this versus that is spared if you are able to like align people on a common terminology. One of the things we see a lot of product teams actually, if your product teams are not aligned on that, then even when you're presenting a roadmap to, eventually, your business teams, you're presenting a roadmap, and then some people call it bets, some people call it opportunities, and then like you're like, wait, is this different? Are we talking here about a different thing here, or is so that's like a, so I love that you've added this.
And that's why I love about tools or tooling in general for product, because it's a way to, I won't say enforce, but yes, you can agree on a terminology. But then if you put it in a tool super visible, then the terminology becomes kind of the norm.
We like to say orchestrate instead of enforce, so it doesn't feel to people like it's a much fancier word of saying like enforce. But yes, and that's one of the reasons why we're having the tool, actually, the ability to like to customize the terminology exactly to your needs, exactly because of this reason, because otherwise people just like end up like fighting about, is it an epic or is it a feature, and then like or is it a bet or is it an opportunity kind of thing. So absolutely. All right,
I think we can, maybe we can go jump to questions, because probably we are running out of time.
Yeah, I think we're kind of like really on time. So love to open it for if you some people send questions mostly about the recording. So I think that means for me that's a great really good, that it means that people enjoy the session. Would love to, if you have any kind of like final questions or comments, happy to take them now. It looks like everybody's just loved the session, so I think that's great. So I think that's fantastic. One last thing I wanted to share with everybody. So this is like the shameless promotion moment for us, just in case you guys are interested. So we do have a 20% off promotion for Craft for people who join this webinar. So feel free to reach out in case that's relevant for you. So just let us know, of course. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to thank Nacho. Thanks so much. It's been super exciting. Oh, we're getting a lot of background noise. I don't know. Maybe, yeah, I think we're good now. So thanks so much, Nacho, and thanks a lot for everybody for the participation and asking questions. And yes, we'll share the deck and the recording. And I wish you all a fantastic rest of the day, evening, morning, wherever you guys are. So thanks a lot, everybody.
Thanks, and thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, Nacho. Thanks so much.